Virtual Gigliotti. In this short video, we're going to talk about what is known as the Battle of the North Atlantic during World War II. That really spans from about 1940 to 1945, with the height of it coming 42, 43. So let's just talk a little bit about it, just so you better understand the situation. So if you think back to what we've already talked about, 1940, Germany defeats France. They divide it in half. You have German-occupied France in the north, which makes really good submarine bases, and then you also have Vichy France, which was an Axis ally down in southern France. And if you look back in 1940, Germany still hadn't invaded the Soviet Union, the United States hadn't gotten involved in the war, and so there was one country that stood alone. That was Great Britain. Right? Great Britain, of course, was an island nation. And with France being knocked out of the war, they were relying on North America to send supplies, food, the means to make war, all of those things. So the Germans believed that if they could stop those supplies from reaching Great Britain, eventually Great Britain would buckle and they would have to surrender. And so we see this sort of cat and mouse war being waged out in the North Atlantic. That really ramps up between the years of 1942 and 1943. As you probably remember from World War I, the Germans have a whole fleet of submarines known as the U-boats. It's really interesting when you look at all of these different countries and where they invested their money and their technology. Whereas America and Japan were building these aircraft carriers, you see the Germans really investing in things like U-boats. The Unterseebooten, there's Admiral Dönitz. Dönitz was the commander of the German Navy, and he told Hitler that he could suffocate England, basically cut off all the trade from North America using his U-boats. And at first he was highly successful. Rather than just using a U-boat by itself to attack some sort of merchant vessel, he created what were known as wolf packs. And if you know anything about wolves, they always hunt together. So these wolf packs would go out in the North Atlantic. They would wait for these Allied convoys to come, and then they would surface in various points and fire on them with deck guns, or they would use their undersea torpedoes. These U-boats were more advanced than the World War I version. They had some battery life that were able to function under the water for a longer period of time. And they start to sink tons and tons and tons of Allied shipping. We're talking about almost half in 1939 to 1943. Any ship that was going from North America, United States or Canada, over to Britain would get sunk. And so the U-boat captains became national heroes. Germans always refer to this period of time as the happy time because they were sinking so many Allied ships, and Britain was in real trouble. They really were. Eventually, the United States gets involved in the Battle of the North Atlantic, and they start to use different tactics and different technologies to change the whole landscape of this battle underneath the sea. One of the things that the Allies do is they create convoys. So rather than having just a couple of ships trying to sail through this wolf pack, you have a whole fleet of ships. You mash your ships together. They can all help defend one another. So the ships on the outside are most likely to engage the U-boats, whereas the ships in the middle are more and more protected as you enter each layer of defense. The other thing that the Allies really monopolize on is technology. They're able to launch a lot of aircraft from England, from Iceland. Iceland is, of course, an island between Europe and North America that the United States took over during World War II, and of course Canada. And they were able to use aircraft to spot the U-boats and then alert the ships from there. There was an area in the middle of the North Atlantic, though, that the aircraft couldn't patrol. It was just too far out. Remember, this is still the 1940s. We don't have satellites and all that other stuff. So they called that the black hole. In the black hole, that's when the Allied shipping was more vulnerable, and they turned to some other technology. One of the emerging technologies that the Allies used was called Huff Duff. And it was basically this big acoustic device, this listening device, and it would bounce some radar waves off, and they could determine if there was a German submarine or a wolf pack nearby. And then if there was, they would use what were called depth chargers. They were basically these barrel bombs that you drop into the ocean. They go down to a certain depth and blow up. They're really good at destroying submarines. And then eventually, this little guy here, known as the Hedgehog, would just launch, dozens of depth chargers towards where you might see a U-boat. So if this huffed up operator says, hey, there's a U-boat off the bow, they turn the Hedgehogs on, and you can see the kind of destructive power that's there. And it doesn't take a lot to sink a submarine, especially if it's submerged. All it takes is a little hole, and the thing goes down. So eventually, by the end of 1943, the Allies had sort of turned the tide in the North Atlantic. More and more ships were able to cross safely, and the German U-boat fleet was becoming less and less and less effective. But this is something that goes on throughout the war, this sort of cat and mouse between the Allied convoys and the German U-boats. Had the German U-boats stopped all of the Allied supplies, Britain would have probably had to surrender. But because they did not, Britain was able to stay strong and keep fighting, which is another reason why eventually the Allies will win the war. So we'll talk more soon. I hope you enjoyed our virtual Gigliotti about the North Atlantic.